It's really quite strange to me to hear a Calvinist say that there's nowhere taught in Scripture supporting the doctrine of the human responsibility, human free will, while at the same time never being able to produce an explicit passage teaching meticulous divine determinism, especially given that we have provided quite a bit of information. Shout out to Brian Wagner here, Dr. Brian Wagner, who is the instructor of church history and theology and biblical languages there at Virginia Baptist College. This is, if you type free will there in at Soteriology 101, and you look this one up, you can find his article on this, where he goes through a study on the doctrine of free will in scriptures and goes through every single passage where this is mentioned. And it is thorough. There's so many passages through the Hebrew, to impel, hence to volunteer as a soldier, to present spontaneously, primarily translated as adverb willingly. Some would not come, but some were convinced, others would not come. There's several passages that talk about people suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. If they're suppressing the truth versus accepting the truth, what is that if not the freedom of the will? Even Calvinists have a difficulty defending this perspective that free will is never, this concept of self-determinism, this self-determination of free will, libertarian free will, is just never established anywhere in the Bible, because even their own confessions seem to defend it to some degree. For example, we've defined the libertarian freedom of the will, as you see there on the screen, as the categorical ability of the will to refrain or not refrain from a given moral action, self-determined. In other words, not determined by factors beyond the accountable agent's control. In other words, you're the first cause of your choices. Your choices are not being caused by God's choice. God's not choosing what you choose. You're the first chooser, if that makes sense. In other words, the cause of a choice is the chooser. The cause of determination is the determiner. And if there's a mystery, that's it. The mystery is that just the same mystery as we have is the God's choices. We don't say what determined God's choice. We just say God did. Well, in the same way, you shouldn't ask what determined Leighton to choose this or that. You should say Leighton did, because Leighton's a determining agent. He's a free moral agent. This is contra-causal choice, the moral ability to choose other than you did. So if I chose to lie yesterday at noon, as a Christian, especially a redeemed Christian, I could have chosen to refrain from lying yesterday at noon. And according to 1 Corinthians 10:13, I could have resisted. He's not tempted me beyond what I can bear. So if I lied yesterday at noon, I could have done otherwise, and I should have done otherwise, and thus I'm accountable because I did so freely. I did so voluntarily. I did so in accordance with my choice, not factors beyond my control, i.e. my desires were causally determined by my nature, which were causally determined with the circumstances that God ultimately causally determined by divine decree, i.e. compatibilism. And then there's biblical examples of this. 1 Corinthians 7:37, he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, has authority over his own will and has decided in his own heart. Okay? 1 Corinthians 10:13 I just mentioned. 1 Corinthians 9:17, for if I do this of my own will, I have reward. But if not of my own will, I'm still entrusted with stewardship. So there's an example of the freedom of the will, voluntarily doing something of one's own will. 2 Corinthians 9:7, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. Exodus 35:29, all the men and women and the people of Israel whose heart moved them. So what moved them? God's divine decree or their heart? It says their heart. Whose heart moved them to bring anything for the work the Lord has commanded by Moses to be done and brought as a free will offering to the Lord. And there are dozens. Go read Brian's article. He just verse after verse after verse, which seem to support this contra-causal, this ability to do otherwise, that you're not being determined by something outside of yourself, i.e. a divine decree of some sort. And even within the Calvinistic confessions, their favorite ones, like the Westminster Confession or the London Baptist Confession, which is almost a direct copy of the Westminster. There in chapter 9 of the Westminster or the London Baptist Confession, it says God has endowed human will with natural liberty and power to act on choices, so that it is neither forced nor inherently bound by nature to do good or evil. Now again, this is talking about Adam and Eve, but it's still quoting verses supporting the concept that Adam and Eve had the liberty of the will. So you can't say that the scriptures never teach this, because you have to at least say, well, the scriptures taught that the first man and woman had it, and God was still sovereign then, wasn't he? Did God lose his sovereignty until men sinned, and then all of a sudden he got sovereign again? See, in other words, free will does not remove sovereignty. Free will is not a contention with sovereignty, because sovereignty has nothing to do with free will. And this is what's so baffling, that even in their own confessions, their own affirmations, Adam and Eve had free will. They had the liberty of the will. They weren't constrained, in other words, by anything outside of themselves to do what they end up doing, either good or evil. Humanity in the state, it goes on to say, of innocence had freedom and power to will to do that which was good and well-pleasing to God. Yet this condition was unstable so that humanity could fall from it. That's contra-causal. They could have listened and obeyed, and they could have fallen from it. They were mutable. They were able to change. They were able to fall. They could have resisted. That is what we mean by libertarian freedom of the will. And so even in their own confessions and their citations of those biblical texts are affirming that free will, self-determination, does exist. And this is the reason you'll hear a lot of Calvinists like Sproul and Piper and others refer to mystery as to why Adam and Eve sinned or why Satan fell from glory. They say, well, we don't know why. And ultimately they're appealing to the mystery of human responsibility, of the creature's responsibility to make their own choices, which is beyond full comprehension. I recognize that. It's beyond full understanding. I recognize that. But what I won't do is impugn the holiness of God by saying that he sovereignly and unchangeably determined my sinful choice to lie yesterday at noon. I take that on me. And I'm certainly not going to blame God for all the people who end up in hell by saying, well, he sovereignly and unchangeably decreed for them to reject the gospel when they could not have done otherwise because of the nature they were born with. I'm sorry, that's just not in the Bible. And I reject it because fundamentally it changes I think the nature of what the gospel is all about, which is a provision for all people so that anyone can be saved.